Picture the skies of the late 1920s. This is no longer an arena for slow, fabric-skinned biplanes. It's a battlefield ruled by speed. In a single second, a new-era monoplane fighter can cover over 300 feet of sky. An enemy aircraft isn't a target. It's a shadow that flashes through your gun sight. A pilot has 1.5, maybe 2 seconds to react, aim, and squeeze the trigger. How much lead can he send downrange in that fleeting moment? 10 bullets? 15? That's desperately inadequate. But what if a weapon could unleash 30, 40, or even 50 rounds in that same sliver of time, creating not just a dotted line of tracers, but a solid buzzsaw of fire that could rip an enemy plane in two? This isn't science fiction. This is the story of a brutal technological arms race and the Soviet Union's answer to it, the fastest aircraft machine gun of its time, a record-breaking weapon whose roar in the sky terrified its enemies and earned the admiration of its allies. Its name was the ShKAS. By the early 1930s, the Soviet Air Force, like all the world's leading air powers, faced a harsh reality. Their existing armament was catastrophically obsolete compared to the evolution of their aircraft. The primary weapons on their fighters and bombers were the PV-1 and DA machine guns. These were reliable, proven designs, but they were fundamentally just adaptations of ground-based weapons. The PV-1 was an aviation version of the legendary but archaic Maxim gun, while the DA was a modification of the Degtyarev infantry machine gun. Their rates of fire, around 600–750 rounds per minute, were acceptable for trench warfare, but they were almost useless in an aerial dogfight where attack windows were measured in seconds. Combat in the sky demanded a totally different philosophy, not a precise sniper-like shot, but the creation of a dense cloud of hot steel in the space ahead of an enemy plane, a cloud he could not escape unscathed. It was in this atmosphere of urgent necessity, within the walls of the Tula Arms Plant's Design Bureau, that one of the most unusual creative partnerships in firearms history was born. On one side was Boris Shpitalny, a young, ambitious, almost audacious engineer who didn't just want to improve old designs. He wanted to break them and build something entirely new. On the other was Irinarkh Komaritsky, a seasoned, old-guard gunsmith, a master craftsman whose hands understood the language of metal and could turn the boldest blueprint fantasy into a functioning mechanism. This fusion of daring, innovative thought, and centuries of gun-making experience was tasked with solving a problem that seemed impossible. They didn't just need to increase the rate of fire by 10 or 20%. They needed to outperform existing systems by a factor of 2 or even 3. And the revolutionary solution they found was hidden in the very heart of the gun. Part 2. Anatomy of a Record. To understand the genius of the ShKAS, you have to forget how a normal machine gun works. In a conventional design, the feeding process is a violent two-step sequence. A claw rips a cartridge backwards out of the ammunition belt, and a bolt slams it forward into the chamber. It's a linear back-and-forth action that creates immense stress and limits how fast the weapon can cycle. Shpitalny and Komaritsky knew that to achieve speeds of 1,800 rounds per minute, this brutal process had to be replaced. Their solution was a radical departure, a revolving drum feed system, nicknamed the birdcage by Soviet airmen. This mechanism was the heart of the gun. Instead of pulling a round straight back, the ShKAS fed the belt into a large rotating cylinder with 10 grooves. As the gun fired, this gas-operated drum would turn, and a fixed, helical cam would gently and progressively ease the cartridge out of its metal link. The entire process of extracting one round was spread out over 10 firing cycles. It was smooth, continuous, and incredibly efficient, replacing the violent jerking of a traditional feed system with a fluid, rotational movement. Once a round was fully clear of the belt at the bottom of the drum's rotation, it was fed directly into the chamber. This system practically eliminated the drag on the ammunition belt, allowing the gun to achieve its record-breaking speed.
But this incredible rate of fire created a new terrifying problem. The ShKAS was too fast for its own food. The standard 7.62 by 54mm R infantry cartridge simply couldn't withstand the tremendous forces inside the gun. The violent extraction and feeding cycle would literally tear the brass cases apart, or the bullet would be pulled loose from the casing before it was even chambered, a malfunction known as unseating. Misfires and jams, a nuisance on the ground, were a potential death sentence in the air. The gun was a masterpiece, but it needed a very special diet. The solution came from Soviet ammunition designer N.M. Elizarov. He created a version of the 7.62 by 54mm R cartridge built specifically for the ShKAS. These were not ordinary rounds. They featured thicker case walls, primers that were double crimped to prevent them from popping out under pressure, and reinforced bullet crimp to keep it firmly seated. To ensure they were never confused with standard infantry ammunition, the case head was stamped with the Cyrillic letter SH, and ammo crates were marked with colored stripes. Firing this specialized ammunition out of a standard Mosin Nagant rifle could damage the weapon, and firing standard rifle rounds in a ShKAS was a recipe for disaster. With its own unique ammunition, the ShKAS was now a complete weapons system, a finely tuned engine of destruction ready to be unleashed. Part 3. Baptism by Fire. In 1932, the ShKAS was officially adopted into service, and the sound of Soviet air power was changed forever. It rapidly became the standard armament for the burgeoning Red Air Force, a tangible symbol of the nation's industrial and engineering might. Production ramped up, and soon the distinct high-speed roar of the ShKAS echoed from the engine cowlings and wings of a new generation of Soviet aircraft. The iconic Polikarpov I-15 and I-16 fighters, nimble and aggressive, were armed with batteries of 4 ShKAS guns. The advanced Tupolev SB and Ilyushin DB-3 bombers bristled with them in defensive turrets. To meet these varied needs, the weapon was produced in 3 distinct configurations: a flexible turret-mounted version for gunners, a fixed wing-mounted model, and a synchronized version designed to fire through the propeller arc of a fighter. For several years, the ShKAS remained a state secret, its true capabilities known only to its creators and users. Its trial by fire, its first introduction to a shocked and unprepared world, would come in the skies over a foreign land, Spain. During the Spanish Civil War in 1936, the Soviet Union supplied the Republican forces with its latest military hardware, including the I-16 fighter. When these planes clashed with the German Heinkel Hi-51 and Italian Fiat CR-32 biplanes flown by the nationalists, the result was a massacre. Pilots accustomed to the slow rhythmic thump-thump-thump of 7.92mm machine guns were suddenly confronted by a terrifying, high-pitched buzzsaw. A short 1-second burst from an I-16's 4 ShKAS guns sent a dense volley of over 100 projectiles into the air. This unprecedented concentration of fire didn't just punch holes in an enemy aircraft, it shattered wooden spars, shredded fabric skins, and tore through control surfaces. Enemy pilots reported seeing their comrades' planes simply disintegrate in mid-air under the fury of these new Soviet guns. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical damage. The firepower advantage was so absolute that it fundamentally changed the calculus of aerial combat. This brutal effectiveness was confirmed again in 1939 during the battles of Khalkhin Gol against the Japanese Empire. Japanese pilots in their nimble but lightly built K-27 fighters were shredded by the concentrated fire from Soviet I-16s and I-153s. The ShKAS had proven its worth. Foreign intelligence agencies scrambled to understand the technology. For years, the gun's performance was so far beyond Western capabilities that many experts refused to believe the reported rate of fire was even possible. By the time Germany unveiled its own high-speed machine gun, the MG-81, the ShKAS had already been dominating the skies for half a decade. It was a weapon that was years ahead of its time, and it had given Soviet pilots a fearsome edge when they needed it most.
Part 4. The Limits of Power. For all its revolutionary performance, the ShKAS was not a perfect weapon. The same complexity that allowed for its incredible speed also made it a notoriously finicky and demanding piece of machinery.
It was, in essence, the high-performance racing engine of the machine gun world, and it required a similar level of expert care. The gun was extremely sensitive to dirt, grime, and improper lubrication. The slightest imperfection in the specialized ammunition could lead to a catastrophic jam. This demanded a new level of professionalism from Soviet ground crews, who had to be specially trained to service and maintain the weapon. An improperly maintained ShKAS was little more than a complicated steel paperweight. Furthermore, the initial production models suffered from a low service life. The immense stress of firing 30 rounds per second took a heavy toll on the gun's components. Early barrels and key parts of the action were often worn out after just 1,500 to 2,000 rounds, less than a minute of total trigger time. While metallurgical improvements and design tweaks would gradually increase its lifespan to a more respectable 5,000 rounds, the ShKAS always remained a weapon that devoured its own parts with the same ferocity it directed at the enemy. Driven by the relentless pursuit of ever greater firepower, Shpitalny's design bureau even attempted to push the concept to its absolute limit with a version known as the UltraShKAS. By further refining the mechanism, they created prototypes that could achieve a blistering 2,600 to 3,000 rounds per minute. It was a staggering technical achievement, but it was a step too far. At these speeds, barrels would heat up and wear out in a matter of seconds. Ammunition feeding became unreliable, even with the special cartridges, and the weapon's overall stability plummeted. The UltraShKAS proved that there was a point of diminishing returns, and the project was wisely abandoned in favor of more reliable and practical solutions. The true twilight for the ShKAS, however, came with the dawn of the Second World War. The nature of air combat was changing again. The fabric-skinned biplanes and fragile monoplanes that the ShKAS had been designed to destroy were being replaced by robust, all-metal aircraft with self-sealing fuel tanks and armor plating around the cockpit and engine. The 7.62mm rifle-caliber bullet, no matter how fast you fired it, simply lacked the kinetic energy and penetrating power to reliably bring down these tougher new opponents. While a hail of ShKAS fire could still shred the control surfaces of a Messerschmitt Bf-109, it struggled to inflict critical damage on a heavily armored Junkers U-87 Stuka or a multi-engine Heinkel H-111 bomber. The era of the rifle-caliber machine gun as the primary armament for fighters was coming to an end. The Buzzsaw's teeth were no longer sharp enough.
Part 5. Legacy of the Buzzsaw. While the ShKAS's dominance as a primary fighter weapon faded with the rise of armored aircraft, its engineering soul lived on. The revolutionary rotary feed system, the very heart of the ShKAS, was too brilliant to abandon. It became the direct genetic ancestor to the Soviet Union's next generation of more powerful and successful aircraft armament. When the need arose for a heavier 12.7mm machine gun, the designer Mikhail Berezin scaled up and simplified the ShKAS feeding concept to create the legendary Berezin UB. More significantly, Shpitalny and his team applied the same core principle to a much larger weapon, creating the 20mm ShVAK cannon. The ShVAK essentially used a scaled-up version of the ShKAS feed mechanism, allowing it to achieve a rate of fire unheard of for a cannon of its caliber. It would become the most important Soviet aircraft cannon of World War II, arming iconic fighters like the Yak-1, La-5, and later models of the Spitfire provided through Lend-Lease. The DNA of the ShKAS was now firing high-explosive shells. The ShKAS machine gun was far more than just a piece of hardware. It was a technological thunderclap that gave the Soviet Air Force a critical, tangible advantage in the crucial years leading up to the Great Patriotic War. It was a stark lesson in how a single daring engineering leap can completely rewrite the rules of combat. For a time, it made Soviet fighters the most heavily armed in the world, giving their pilots a surge of confidence and a formidable weapon to wield in the violent skies of Spain and the Far East.
It forced the world's other air powers to play catch-up, accelerating the global arms race in aircraft weaponry. In the final analysis, the ShKAS stands as a perfect symbol of its time, an era of frantic technological innovation where victory was measured in miles per hour and rounds per minute. It was a complex, demanding, and ultimately transitional weapon, a bridge between the slow-firing guns of the past and the heavy cannons of the future. Though its time on the front lines was relatively brief, its influence was profound. The legacy of the ShKAS is not just in the museum pieces that remain, but in the design philosophy that echoed through a generation of subsequent Soviet aircraft guns, giving them a speed and firepower that stemmed directly from the genius of that first rotary feed. It was the original Buzzsaw, and its roar set the tempo for the air wars to come.